In Chapter 2 of Architecture of Migration, Anurada Siddiqui gives an incomplete take on emergency/temporary refugee settlements. Due to ongoing conflicts and government's individual interests, those living in temporary encampments are forced to build permanent communities in what were initially interim compounds. The lack of unbiased media means the true state of these camps is very different from that which is broadcast worldwide for publicity purposes. Siddiqui's Architecture of Migration, while providing a very informative perspective on sedentarization, lacks an in-depth analysis on emergency settlements and the ways they are utilized for oppression. The implementation of emergency settlements with the intent of promoting sedentarization prompts the decline of nomadic communities. Because of the rigid repressive laws and transgressive actions, individuals' welfare is often ignored. Currently, settlements serve as a promotional mechanism for governments and a way to monitor and contain the nomadic community. These settlements and their process of creation directly shape the relationship between land and architecture, as construction focuses on control as opposed to focusing on the refugees' well-being.
Segregation is not the only issue resulting from emergency territories. Negative effects can be measured on the camp itself and the surrounding land of architecture. Siddiqui argues that the ecological impact of creating new settlements, clearings of the land, rapid deforestation, etc., leads to camps depleting their natural resources. To survive, refugees have often engaged in extreme foraging and denuding of vegetation in the vicinity of camps. Siddiqui 101. Gottfried Semper's Four Elements of Architecture states that architecture derives from the essentiality of building. These emergency camps are a direct opposition to this belief. These camps take architectural individualism away from not only the locals, but also from the refugees. They are forced into this new architecture with no chance to reclaim their own ideas of spatial design. At Dadaab, uneven access to ecological resources has escalated tensions between communities of displaced people and their hosts, manufacturing a sense of lack centered on land. Siddiqui 101.
While Siddiqui's arguments emphasize the challenges pertaining to the creation of emergency territories, it fails to address the issues related to the settlements once government funding and humanitarian aid end. During 1993 and 1994, over 800,000 immigrants between Rwanda and Burundi fled into Tanzania, and dozens of emergency territories were set up along Tanzania's border. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, together with local governments, invested over 15 million USD into settling the refugees. Gradually, as conflicts resolved, refugees began returning to their homes and camps were closed. With the departure of refugees, the bustling market that had grown with the increased population began to suffer. Locals were at risk of losing their income and their own food supplies. Siddiqui's inadequacy to convey the full lifespan of camps leads the reader to believe that camps, once closed, do not have lasting effects on the communities around them.
Moving throughout the chapter, Siddiqui asserts that these camps were not established with good intention. They directly oppose the sovereign people who have been living on the land for centuries. These camps were constructed with the purpose of legitimizing sedentarization, a common nomadic structure in the Minyata, a special form of housing. It was a fortified compound, but also a temporary home. This piece of architecture was turned against the nomadic people and became an immoral form of forced settlement. Siddiqui's claim fails to include the degradation of nomadic lifestyles, which ceases any ideas the refugees have of abandoning their settlements and returning to traditional survival methods. This social effect leads to tensions between refugees and ultimately causes their own traditional housing to be used against them.
There are parallels that can be drawn between the Kenyan refugee camps and other events in history, such as the Japanese internment camps in the 1940s. Japanese internment occurred as a reaction to the bombing of Pearl Harbor during World War II. Due to propaganda delivered by the American government, Japanese Americans were perceived as being possible spies, which led to a general fear among the American public. To address the concerns of U.S. citizens, the government undertook a measure to place Japanese Americans on the West Coast into temporary settlements. These temporary camps, like those in the Dadaab encampment, provided basic vital amenities, but not much more. Being treated as prisoners, the Japanese Americans struggled with the accusations in addition to the poor living conditions within the camp. While more in-depth knowledge is now available about the history of Japanese internment and its negative effects on the entrapped, many other emergency territories are kept in complete isolation without adequate media coverage. The coercive acts of the government in control, particularly in camps that house rebels, are not exposed to the public.
Encampments provide housing, food, water, and other necessities. However, they often fail to address the mental health of those who reside in the settlements. Refugees have commonly been diagnosed with depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and panic. While many mental health issues such as PTSD are linked with previous traumatic events, other mental health disorders like depression are associated with the daily stresses of living in settlements. Conditions of adversity, prolonged detention, uncertainty of residency status, lack of study and work opportunities, and other issues related to the future stability of refugees further contribute to the deterioration of their mental health. Studies have revealed that for every 10% increase in the number of days at a refugee camp, there is an increase of over 1,000 cases of mental health crisis.
While all this depicts emergency camps as transgressive and immoral, emergency territories have also had success in supporting refugees. During the Syrian civil war in the 2010s, the UNHCR developed and implemented a diverse strategy that would not just provide shelter and aid to those living during this crisis, but to also improve the socioeconomic and environmental qualities of life as a community. With Syrian infrastructure still being hospitable, the UNHCR was able to focus on humanitarian aid and keeping people healthy and safe. Their work was an attempt to direct countries in a more liberal direction. They tried not just to secure housing rights for everyone, but worked on gender, diversity, and equality rights as well. While never mentioned by Siddiqui, this topic is important because the emergency territories have helped and supported millions of refugees worldwide. In the beginning of the chapter, Siddiqui argues that architecture is imposed, integrated, yet fundamentally separated from the area around it, both socially and economically. This argument implies a camp's physical architecture promotes a more prominent divide between the refugees and the surrounding territories and communities than other factors such as different ethnic, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds. Furthermore, as refugees are further dependent on government funding, their financial security places them in the lower scale of the social classes, further enhancing the separation from locals beyond physical boundaries.
Siddiqui's architecture of migration depicts refugee camps as detrimental to refugees. It is common knowledge that the portrayal of shocking and devastating situations gains more attention than heartwarming stories of everyday success cases. Historical data diverging negative characteristics is more common than the publication of positive experiences of refugees. While it is understood that improvement could be made to minimize the difficulties of these already devastated individuals, one cannot ignore that the creation of settlements ultimately saves lives. While constant criticism lies in the over-control of governments, examples of successful settlements have shown that adaptation and integration only occur with the full commitment and organization of governments.
Anurada Siddiqui's Architecture of Migration, Chapter 2, is a powerful section of her book that illustrates the tumultuous beginnings of emergency camps and the harsh negative effects they've had on the culture and architecture of refugees who were unfortunate enough to be coerced into this form of sedentarization, while presenting as a very illuminating tale to those unaware of the terrible conditions that refugees have been facing for the past century. It is a one-sided argument. It fails to discuss the good deeds that emergency territories and humanitarian aid have done for refugees. Even if the good is minimal, it has helped people. Despite this, Anurada Siddiqui's second chapter of Architecture of Migration is still a phenomenal, eye-opening passage regarding the history and politics of emergency territories across the world.